Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. My name is Ted Forbes, and today I want to share with you one of my very favorite photographers. And I've never talked about him on the show before, but he had a tremendous impact on me in the early stages of my own artistic development, and I think this was for a number of reasons. And of course I'm talking about the famous Czech photographer Josef Sudek. Sudek speaks to me, I think, one, just the absolute beautiful quality of his images. There's a real sense of thoughtfulness, there's a maturity, there's a wonderful play with light, and there's an aesthetic that kind of transcends trends and style. And I think the second reason also plays into that because, I think a lot of it was the time that he lived, basically, starting out in the 1920s when pictorialism was at its height, moving on to becoming more of a modernist after that, and doing commercial work, that there's a cohesive style and personality that kind of transcends this big aesthetic change that you have in photography, and we're going to look at that today. Josef Sudek is very interesting. He was born in 1896 and spent the early part of his career actually preparing to go into printing and bookbinding. And it wasn't until 1915, when he did his service in the army and was stationed on the Italian front, he was actually injured and had to have his arm amputated. So, here's a gentleman who is in the military, stationed in Italy, and he's kind of given a camera and with no prior experience, and that's his introduction into photography and how he got into it. After leaving the military, he spent the next 2 years in Prague studying formally and led a very interesting career. The early stuff that he did in the 20s was very much in the pictorialist style, and we did an episode on pictorialism. I will link that up at the end of the video, and if you're really into Sudek and a lot of these images, particularly the earlier stuff, it's worth checking out the stuff that we did on pictorialism because it's such a beautiful time in photography, and this challenge of being thoughtful about photography and raising it to a level of fine art that it didn't have achievement with before that. Painting was considered fine art, and photography early on was considered largely a gimmick. And a lot of these early artists, these early pictorialists, were really trying to achieve that. Now, Sudek, his career, I think, can be pretty much split into two sections for me. The earlier stuff definitely has that pictorialist quality, and then post-1920s, when you get into the 30s, there's a post-pictorialist quality to it. And I'm just calling it post-pictorialist because, you hear critics who put a lot of associations with various words like neo-romanticism or modernism into his work. And I don't think that at that point in his career he really took much of a stance into a specific style. I think that Sudek was looking at things beyond that. I think his work was very personal in nature. He was the kind of person who kept extremely to himself. I don't think that he had a lot of associations, never married. In fact, it's kind of rumored that he didn't even show up to his own shows when he had openings. And this is very interesting. Also, until the year before he died, he'd never had a show in the US before, which I think is kind of interesting as well. Eastman House did something, I think, right before he died. And so, this is just a really different kind of person. This is a person who's not associated with ego or fame or fortune or anything like that. And I think it's best if we go over and check out some of the images. And so I kind of want to show you how this stuff fits in between the early stuff and the late stuff. And you're going to see there's a common thread compositionally that just really overreaches and stretches beyond anything that was going on aesthetically. So come on over and let's have a look at the work of Josef Sudek. So in case you're new to the show, you might like to know that I use Pinterest for reviewing work when we're talking about photographers. And there's a couple reasons why. Pinterest offers a great way of bookmarking images. And so if you want to go look at my account, you can go see with the sources where I got these and explore more images by the artists that I'm talking about too, which makes it's a really nice setup, and it's a great way to present them on the show. So my Pinterest account is pinterest.com/TedForbes. And I do have a board set up just for Josef Sudek. And I've had this up for a while, actually, just because he's somebody I've always admired and followed. Now, I'm going to jump around a lot on this. I'm going to warn you. I want to kind of, we'll get it away up front, out of the way, that Josef Sudek, there are basically two big periods of his work. There's the early pictorialist stuff that he did in the 1920s, and by about 1930 onwards, his work started to change, and he went through some smaller aesthetic changes, but, you kind of have this early work and this later work. But I don't want to focus too much on that because I think it's fairly obvious. What I do want to focus is the common thread that you're going to see through both of these styles that he does, and that is compositional sense and mainly what he does with light. And I think that is the most important thing that you're going to take away from Sudek's work. It was almost like an obsession of his, is ways to manipulate light into the composition to create interest, and he was one of the greats at this, if not the greatest. And so you're going to see a lot of different kinds of things in here. So just real quick to talk about kind of the two periods, you have this early image of these two women walking into a church here. And this is very pictorialist in style. It has a painterly type quality to it, particularly with the way that the soft focus works, the way that, you don't have anything that's super sharp in here. And it does give it, more toned down quality. And a lot of the pictorialists were really after this because they were trying to get their work to operate more in the way like a painting would. And that was a little bit of the challenge back then, because if you consider, in the early days of photography, it was not accepted as a fine art form. It was thought of as just kind of a cheating way of drawing something or capturing something as an image. And so a lot of these people were really pushing the limits of what they could do. And, I have a whole separate episode on that. But anyway, Sudek's earliest work definitely falls into that realm. It's very much, this soft focus, painterly quality. But what you're going to notice is even in these early works is that light is permeating through these in a very special way. And so you have this image where it's the soft lighting that comes down, and it's almost as if you're looking through mist or haze or an early morning light or something of that nature, maybe in cooler weather or something. And it really has a beautiful quality to it. The way the brick has a slight reflection, which, probably is due to moisture in the air as well. And, this is kind of that early style that Sudek was known for. One of my favorite images from this era is this one of this trolley coming through, this archway with a gentleman walking in front of it. It's like the composition just works. Everything is slightly off center. It almost starts playing to the rule of thirds in a way, with that classical composition sense. But also look at the way the lines go in the perspective, the way the brick runs on the, across the ground, and the way that light just peeks in. And your subjects in here happen to be the trolley car, and more importantly, the gentleman who you just see a silhouette of walking. And that's another important thing that I think you see a lot in Sudek's work too, is you don't see, really obvious portraits. I think that figures that are, presented within his compositions are more, kind of everyman kind of concept, where it's just maybe you see yourself in here, maybe you see somebody else in here. You don't recognize it with a specific person. And I think that's fairly interesting and, a big hallmark of Sudek. The later work that you see where he kind of retreated and spent a lot of time in his studio, there's some very thoughtful still life compositions, just very simple of this egg and a plate, but again, the way the light is coming through the window, and even though it's not quite as dramatic per se as, say, maybe some of the early more pictorialist nature stuff, that is still a very prominent theme in his work. You see it again here. And also, and I think this is interesting, and I didn't do this intentionally, but I think this does play into, if you watch us every week, I've been doing a big series on a project that I'm doing, and I mentioned earlier that Sudek is a huge influence on me. And one of the things that I'm very interested in, particularly on this project that I'm doing right now, is how to create abstraction into photography. And you get that here. The way that there's all this moisture on the window, probably taken on a cold morning, or it could be raining outside, but I think it's more, moisture that's formed on the actual window, but it creates an abstraction to that background. This is not the same photograph if that window is clear. And the reason being is most likely that background becomes too prominent, and the way that the flower in the foreground or the flowers that we're looking at play against that, you just lose it in the detail. It would not be possible. So, that's a major part of this composition, and also the way the light diffuses and comes through, and that being the hallmark of Sudek's work. Jumping around, like I said I was going to do, there's a set of images that he took at St. Vitus Cathedral. And these are probably some of his more well-known images, and these are fairly early on. What I find really interesting about these is, again, the way the light plays through here. And a lot of times, especially with these early photographers, we just don't have a common record of a lot of the techniques that were used in these things. And some of the early pictorialists were doing some really radical stuff with their work. And this is a really interesting project to do as well, would be to kind of discover and document some of the possible techniques of these early people, because it's kind of a mystery, I think, to common knowledge. But this image, I happen to do know something about, that Sudek was interviewed at one point and was talking about staging this. And basically, they had this wonderful cathedral, the construction and work that's going on there, and there's a lot of dust in there. And literally, he had his assistant go down there with blankets and just start stirring up dust. And what that enabled him to do was to get those light beams that are coming through the windows. And it has such a beautiful quality to it. And I do know that that was, the effect that was desired. So, what's really interesting about Sudek is that, he went through and actually, at least in the cases that I know about here with the way this cathedral works, it's another shot as well, is that these were actually, the light situation was created. It was an effect that he was going for strongly. And you have to admit, I mean, this is a different photo if you don't have those light rays coming in. That's what makes and defines the photo. And the effect is there's dust in the air that's been stirred up in a rapid fashion, and so you have a haze you're shooting through. But it adds such a nice opacity to the image, translucency to it, because it's a material you're looking through, and the way the light reacts with that, it really shows off the light and shows that. Another image too, and I told you I'm bouncing around here, but this is another one of my favorites, and it's a still life that's kind of odd, and it has what appears to be maybe, peacock feathers, a shoe, something that kind of looks like a knife sticking out of a bowl, although I think it's a shadow. But the entire key behind this image is the dramatic lighting. And, this is probably a later image of Sudek's where he was getting more into the still life kind of thing. But it has such a sense of drama and a sense of mystery that you can make out a couple of those objects and you can't make out all of them. But the source of attention here and where your eye is drawn is right into that light, which is behind that vase that you see over in this lower third over here. And so, again, just this obsession with light all the time. What's also interesting is when you look at this in modern terms with contemporary photographers, so many people today use artificial lighting, with flashes. And there's a whole art to that, and it's very controlled, it's very beautiful. But what I think is particularly interesting is Sudek. And I think, indeed, he was a photographer who was way ahead of his time. And what's interesting about this is these were not done with, speed lights or expensive flash gear. These were done usually with natural things, with things that were found. And his interest and obsession with manipulating light in that way, I think, is just outstanding. Another beautiful one that is another very famous later photo that he did. This is in '69. This is just basically the view from his studio window. And what makes this so creepy is the distortions you see through the window, through the glass, and this big galumphing, blurring figure that you see in the middle of the image here that's a little frightening when you start to look at it. But there's a sense of motion that's carried through this image, and it's not done necessarily through moving the camera or through blurring something, but it is achieved by, again, light. And this is, the hallmark of his work. Also worth noting are some of these nighttime outdoor exposures that he did of night lights. And you got to realize, too, that in the time that Sudek shot these, he died in '75. So, we're looking at the very latest this photo was probably late '60s, early '70s. And even the technology at that time to be shooting night images, now you do have a lot of light going on in this image, but film was just really slow at that time. You didn't have high ISOs. There was a time when 100 was a high speed ISO. A lot of the early films were really slow, like 32 or 64 or 50, and 100 was actually considered high speed at one point. And so what's interesting is you look at work like Sudek and also probably somebody like Brassai, and harkening back to that still life we were looking at earlier, is to manipulate light to be able to shoot at night and be able to make these images possible. This image looks like it's shot through glass with moisture on it, and it has a blurred out effect. Even the points that are sharp and in focus, like what appears to be a nail or a screw or a button or something down here, are a little bit mysterious in a lot of ways. Later in his life, Sudek did a series of what he called his Labyrinth images. And what these were basically shots of his, let's say, eclectic studio. And it's really interesting because I think you start to get a glimpse, and I think this window is technically part of that series too, but you start to see a glimpse of just kind of these still life setups, but in some of them, you start to see things in the image that are certainly playing with it, but maybe are some clues into some of the effects and some of the things that Sudek was experimenting with. So if you look right in front of this bottle here, you see this circular thing. And is it just a piece of plastic? It's some kind of opaque material. There's obviously a screen or a frame in the back. And it could be that these were items lying around his studio, but I kind of tend to want to think that they were things he was experimenting with to get light to run through to, make the shot something different. Because like here we have, this wine glass, and this is from the Glass Labyrinths. And again, we're kind of back to that pictorialist soft focus, almost pencil drawn quality to something, particularly with the black and white images, and it's outstanding. It's beautiful. It's amazing, and you see a lot of this. Here's some more of the later ones, again shot through glass with the moisture. This one's so dead simple, coming back to the egg and the plate. A lot of these. There's one or two that I did not show you here. I'm trying to get those before we cruise, but yeah, here's another one where I was talking about earlier, where these figures are probably representing, humanity, or it could be anyone. It's not an identifiable portrait that you're going to recognize from somebody. But this is also a beautiful pictorialist thing too. Is like, you have this figure on the right who's pretty much a silhouette. He's there for a little balance in the composition. But this gentleman on the left here, the way he's not totally a silhouette, and if you look at the way the light just kind of hugs around his face a little bit and starts giving you a little bit of definition in there with the hair, the hairstyle, the front of his shirt, and the way it also reflects and comes off of the glass that he's pouring here. It's just outstanding work, and it doesn't get much better than that. But anyway, that has been the work of Josef Sudek, and I hope you have found this interesting, and like me, hopefully found it inspiring on some level. And, I would encourage you to explore more, get on Pinterest. What's cool about these is you can kind of go through and find other people's boards, particularly with Sudek's work or anybody you're interested in, and follow and explore and go see the sources where I got these. If you click on the actual large image, it'll take you to that. So that's the work of Josef Sudek. Josef Sudek is a very different kind of photographer for me. And when you normally think of pictorialism, you tend to think of Stecken, Stieglitz, and a lot of the other photographers who were part of these camera clubs at that time. And like I said, I'm going to link to the episode that we did on pictorialism a while back, because I think it's still important, genre and time in photography. And what's interesting is Sudek, I think you don't hear his name come up in those circles as much. When you think of Sudek, you don't think of 1920s pictorialism necessarily. But what I find very interesting about Sudek, and I think this is the reason why, is because you have somebody who's very introverted in nature and is clearly making work from a very personal level, and his entire drive is coming from within to push himself further and to do new things. And he was very adamant about that. And I think because his style was able to really transcend a particular aesthetic or a particular general style, that this is what makes him a very important photographer. And so anyway, like I said before, Sudek is extremely inspirational to me on a number of levels. If you watch the show, you know that I tend to pick photographers and I really get excited when people are kind of the underdog. Like, maybe they didn't, get their due when they were alive as far as their importance as a photographer, or maybe they started late in their careers. And anyway, I think these things are really cool because they keep it very real. And I think in that sense also that Josef Sudek is very real. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I'm going to link up in just a second to the Pictorialism show, so go check that out if you're interested in photographers of that era. So anyway, once again, guys, this has been another episode of The Art of Photography. I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.